Oh, there it is. Happy Saturday and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Takiwa Smith. Founder, Executive Director of Science, Engineering, and Mathematics Link, and I want to welcome you to our Math and Science Career Academy STEM in the City workshop. The purpose of the STEM in the City workshop, let me slow down, is to expose youth to the various STEM careers and fields in earth and environmental sciences. The reasons why we focus on these sciences is because these are the sciences that impact our everyday lives, from our water quality, air quality, access to clean water, clean air, soil to grow our food, urban agricultural, green space. Pretty much when you step outside your door, and sometimes in your home, I think, I have to double check with those things that can impact your quality of life, access to food, your health, because bad air, bad health outcomes, right? Like you have asthma and different respiratory disease. And so we wanted to make sure that you got an opportunity to learn about these fields that impact your everyday lives, because we need scientists and STEM professionals to study these fields to make the world around us and livable. I don't think that's a word, but quite a good quality of life for the plants and animals in our ecosystems, in our food sources and air sources and water sources. So, without further ado, I am going to introduce Carlin Pounders, our program coordinator, who is going to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Takiwa. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Saturday afternoon. Excited to get into some interesting STEM topics with Dr. Viniece Jennings, who is a purpose-driven scholar, educator, and environmental professional. Her research often explores urban green spaces and health in the context of ecosystem services, environmental justice, and social cohesion. She led research on green space, health disparities, and social determinants of health across the US, which was recognized as top research for practice by the National Recreation and Parks Association. Her research has been published in various science journals, and her expertise is featured in local and national outlets. She serves as an assistant professor at Agnes Scott College and has over a decade of experience with the federal government, where she previously served as a research scientist. She earned her bachelor's degree in environmental science from Delaware State University and a doctorate in environmental science with a focus in policy and management from Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, also known as FAMU. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Jennings.
Thank you. Thank you both for the introductions and even the invitation to speak to your youth this morning. Is these types of experiences that really help to plant the seed of what is possible in different fields. I remember when I was a junior in high school, there was a speaker who came for a career day and really showed another aspect of the environmental field, which is where I am today. So I just want to thank you all again, not only for the invitation, but the hard work that you're doing to coordinate this series, but also bring diverse voices and the contributions that they have in STEM to this particular forum. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and share my screen or share my information so that we can go ahead and get started. The introduction was already provided, but I definitely don't want to give the impression that I walked across the stage from high school onto this Zoom with you this afternoon. It's definitely been a journey in terms of different aspects of my work that has taken place throughout the years. And it's so interesting that before this talk, I had a friend from college, you know, when she heard about me speaking this morning, just talking about 20 years ago, when I was in college, helping to organize a campus recycling program and really help our college or university to get on the bandwidth of thinking about recycling in a college setting to do that and get it started and where we are today. So even though, I'm talking about the role that urban green spaces have when it comes to different dimensions of health, a part of me was definitely inclined to title this, Head, Heart, and Hustle, when it comes to what I've contributed to the field through the years, but even when it comes to really moving toward general goals. So with that being said, I want to definitely reposition the conversation to the overarching theme for this series, talking about the city and really this phrase of urbanization, in which a place becomes developed over time and is really becoming more urban and reflective of a city. So while we may think of these settings and skyscrapers or stadiums and highways may come to mind, this juncture of what we build from a structural standpoint also interfaces with different aspects of the environment that can lead to stressors that are relevant in cities and even to the health of people who live in cities. So that can range from a number of things, such as an increase in pollution, the compaction even of the strain that these structures put on the Earth's surface, and how even the development process begins to reshape the land in a sense that leads to what we call fragmentation. And that occurs when there's a disruption, if you will, or really some type of change in the pathway when it comes to the landscape and vegetation. And those different disruptions can really impact environmental quality. And while these are the spaces where we live, more and more projections are showing how the Earth's population and society at large is gravitating to these urban centers. So, with this in mind, while we may think of it from the standpoint of what it is we want in cities and the amenities that we have in place, there's a foundational role that vegetation plays from the standpoint of an ecological perspective. And one of the phrases that was mentioned in my bio that I definitely wanted to make sure I provided a bit more context of is that of ecosystem services. And this was often framed in reports such as the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And it talks about the benefits that we receive from the natural environment and ways to categorize those. And this is really important, even from the standpoint of what the environment and different aspects of natural systems, such as urban green spaces, can provide. Because when we don't recognize the inherent value of different aspects of the environment and even within people, we may be more prone to actually abuse or mishandle those resources. And that's something we definitely cannot afford to do as we are moving closer and closer to more of our population being in these centers. So according to this report, they really categorize these ecosystem services from the standpoint of being supporting, such as photosynthesis and even soil formation and biodiversity. When we think of the house of an ecosystem, vegetation plays a key role as the producers, which is very important for the foundation to which all life is going to be supported on. So really recognizing that from the standpoint of what vegetation does becomes instrumental in the respect of how we build, how we manage, and actually how we live and thrive in the places that we know as cities. The next category includes those more so in the provisional. This can be pollination, as was mentioned earlier, the service of filtering water becomes very, very important. Last, and actually the next one involves regulating. That could be from the standpoint of really providing some type of buffer when it comes to, let's say, controlling flooding, again, purifying water, but also clean air from the standpoint of, again, that amount of pollution that begins to be concentrated in cities and what that can mean for vegetation. And there's a study that I was involved with, which I'll give some additional context to that one. But the last category, which is actually an area where I've been focusing more of my work on these days, is that in a sense of cultural ecosystem services. And there have been studies, for example, in articles or journals such as the Proceedings from the National Academy of Sciences and others that document how these cultural ecosystem services are ones that really begin to delve into different aspects of the lived experience from a social dynamic, such as really providing an avenue for education, recreation, and even that aesthetic appearance that we like to have in cities. But again, thinking about it from the balance. Often we may think of vegetation in the sense of really accessorizing or using vegetation to accessorize cities. But again, thinking about the cultural as well as the overarching value that they have under this framework begins to be very, very important. So while we think about that from the initial standpoint, I want to zoom the camera out a bit more, if you will, when it comes to this larger vision of sustainable development. And a number of organizations have really begun to reposition this and how cities are moving forward with this. And as you can imagine, this overlaps with the availability of green spaces. And some of those include in terms of really being able to support different dynamics of health promotion, as well as sustainable cities in the sense of how we are functioning today and what that can mean for future generations, but also even from the standpoint of the way that we should be responsibly using these resources so that they can be sustained, maintained, and properly managed over time. And last but not least, in the sense of really thinking about life on the land, that can be in the respect of different organisms, human beings as well, and what that means for us to be able to live and thrive in a way that's not impairing the environment to our detriment. And with this in mind, through the years, there has been this growing body of literature, which has really helped to reposition the field. But one of the things that definitely energizes me in my work is to really help to bridge the gap between different areas of knowledge, whether that's from the environmental field, where my training has been through the years, but also expanding that to different dimensions of public health. And the framework of ecosystem services begins to do that because we think about aspects of the environment, not only in terms of their inherent value, but more so when it comes to how that connects to different dimensions of human health and well-being. And this has also been discussed in a number of different documents, again, bringing it a bit more into the context of here in the United States. The American Public Health Association provided a policy statement, really talking about how access to nature can be an avenue to improve health and wellness. And in these policy statements, you can notice how there are other overarching issues or other topics that are connected to this area of work. So when we begin to connect these dots in ways to not only think about it in the standpoint of trees and then public health, but how this really begins to integrate into a whole bunch of other topics when it comes to land use, for example, the way that people have access to foods and so many other avenues. This begins to reposition the conversation. But again, I'm not making the notion like if you hug a tree for a certain amount of days and all of your health issues will be gone. That's not what I'm saying. But it's really to recognize the value that these environmental systems bring to so many areas of work, but also to the way that we thrive. So with this in mind, some of the areas where I have focused my research include, I would say, three overarching themes, which I'll dive into. And again, that's in the standpoint of public health and well-being. There's that classic definition of health that was provided to us by the World Health Organization in 1948. And it really reminds us that health isn't just about a clinical diagnosis, but really a more holistic perspective of social well-being, psychological well-being, and so many other dimensions. And we're beginning and continuing to tap into what that means when it comes to urban green spaces in the days that we're in, but also environmental health disparities. There's been a number of different scholars, which I'll go into, who have provided a lot of context to what this means. But again, really thinking about that link that the environment has to public health in general, but how does this vary across different socioeconomic variables? How does this differ by race and income? And this is really important when we talk about health disparities, meaning major gaps in health, to see where can we identify different areas of vulnerability, but also where we can support different types of solutions from a scholastic perspective. And last but not least, social determinants of health, which I'll be going into briefly, really talk about, it's generically described as those conditions where we live, where we work, and where we play. But these begin to really undergird the social aspects of where we live. That could be from the standpoint of education, as well as even the neighborhood and the built environment. So my area of work has really talked about how we can cultivate social cohesion in terms of how we interact with one another through the availability or even the lack of green spaces and what that means from a public health perspective. So when I mentioned this in the standpoint of health disparities, this was an article that we published, and it really talked about really synthesizing the literature, getting a baseline of what we know at different points of time so that we can strategically move forward. So in this process, we look through hundreds, honestly, of articles to see what are some of those reoccurring themes that we need to reposition, what green spaces can provide when it comes to health in underserved communities, those that are racially and ethnically diverse, but also those that are considered low income. And I bring those two particular facets up because those two categories are very important in our definition of environmental justice and the communities that are considered in the pursuit of environmental justice. And some things that we observed in this article were some reoccurring themes for health outcomes such as cardiovascular issues, obesity, heat-related illness, as well as psychological distress. So when we think about which communities have access to these resources and what that means for those particular dimensions of health, those were some overarching or reoccurring areas that we found. But then being able to put this into the larger picture of, as I mentioned before, these social determinants of health. This is a major framework in the field of public health, but different documents, for example, the Healthy People documents, which are produced every 10 years, really have been tapping into this a lot more when it comes to a framework of how we begin to reposition not only how we perceive health, but also how we connect it to different aspects. Again, that could be education, it could be access to healthcare, economic stability, as well as the social and community context. And as I look at this slide, it's so apropos, if you will, some of the scholars that are mentioned on this particular slide, they all happen to be African American scholars, but I wanted to recognize the foundational role that their work has played, not only when it comes to categorizing and really contributing to what we know about social determinants of health, but they have also laid a foundation of work that I've done through the years when it comes to really building upon what we know about urban green spaces, and then how we position not only diverse communities, but the nation forward so that we can pursue different dimensions of health. And those scholars include, for example, Dr. Payne Sturgis, Dr. Kamara Jones, who's done quite a bit of work for the environmental as well as health field, talking about how different dimensions of how communities are treated really impact their access to health and possibility of health promotion. And last but not least, on the last bullet, the work by Dr. Myron Floyd, who's at NC State. And he's talked about through the years what this means in the context of not only the ethics of what access to green spaces and parks mean for human health and well-being, but what this means from the standpoint of again, recreation and different aspects of how we thrive in these spaces. So putting these two areas of thought in mind, again, we started out with the ecosystem services, but then connecting that to these social determinants of health. Believe it or not, the scholars in this field weren't necessarily bridging those conversations too well. So with that in mind, this led to me writing, myself and some other colleagues, writing this article to really bridge that gap between the environmental and public health arenas, to really look at the literature again and see what do we know and how can we categorize this in a way to strategically move forward. So as you can notice from this table, we outline those different social determinants of health and then link those to those cultural ecosystem services that I talked about, and really explore what that meant in different regards to these benefits, such as psychological as well as physical well-being. Moving on down, for example, to the built environment. How does this begin to develop a sense of community satisfaction, access to food, avenues to reduce crime and in other incivilities within a community, and really to develop a sense of place in terms of people belonging and having pride in their local area. This is very important to not only how people perceive their place, but also their communities and themselves when it comes to those that they interact with. There's been research also documenting how access to green spaces can relate to even academic performance and really students having a place to reprieve or being able to function in the academic setting in ways that can enhance their performance. And last but not least, from the standpoint of economic stability, we found some overarching themes or reoccurring themes, if you will, when it came to what this means for community revitalization and even prices of housing or different types of property, which we'll also dive into later. So with that in mind, we think of, the city and what the conversation of different types of green spaces can mean, there was an area of work that we did this from the stance of looking at city parks and this of subjective well-being. And subjective meaning it in the sense of how do people perceive their well-being from different regards. And in this study, we looked at 46 cities from throughout the United States. And the category for subjective well-being, we actually used data from the Gallup Healthways database. And that categorized it from the sense of social well-being, community well-being, financial well-being, as well as even aspects of purpose. Now, we actually found that areas which had a larger coverage of parks, particularly city parks, had a stronger dynamic when it came to community well-being in the sense of people being able to galvanize and really, again, have that local pride, but even to build connections. Sometimes we underestimate that having access to a park where you can meet people safely and be able to build those connections, meet neighbors, begin to be different social fabric of a community that you can tap into. And this relates to how you have different aspects of well-being. So while this particular study was from the standpoint of really thinking about parks and subjective well-being, I've also been involved in work which has looked at this from an empirical standpoint when it comes to the structure of green spaces themselves. And for example, there was a project that I was involved in Tampa during my dissertation work where we looked at these 4 data sets and combined them for some overarching areas of work. And that included some census data just to get a background, for example, from folks within the city of Tampa, but also even that from the standpoint of the tree cover. What was the leaf area index like? What was the actual conditions of the trees? And then overlapping that with satellite imagery from some secondary data from Micro Andrew, as well as others from the University of Florida. But thinking about that from the standpoint of thinking of how that connects to different dimensions of health. And specifically for this project, we looked at it from the standpoint of, again, cardiovascular health in the terms of providing an avenue for physical activity, but also from the standpoint of respiratory health in terms of that ability for tree cover to remove air pollution or actually be a repository, if you will, for it. But what that means for different conditions, whether that's bronchitis, asthma, and wheezing. And in the standpoint of doing this, one of my colleagues and co-authors on this text, Alex, really used this geospatial technique known as kriging. So even though we had different points where we had sample plots for the tree cover data, this particular technique helps us to fill the gaps of what is missing and be able to provide estimates based on these mathematical models, and then connect that to those other data sets that I mentioned before. And it was interesting in this particular area of work, again, we had the overlap of what was going on within those different data points in Tampa, but we wanted to connect that with those incidents of health outcomes, particularly, again, cardiovascular as well as respiratory health. And we found that there was a decrease as there was an increase in tree cover, being an inverse relationship. And we found that for both health outcomes. So again, this isn't suggesting that that this is the only factor that is involved in the incidence of these health outcomes. But again, to speak to a number of literature that has been produced and published through the years, we found that there was an inverse relationship when it came to the leaf area index, which can be used as an indicator of how much air pollution is removed, the coverage of the actual canopy cover itself throughout the city of Tampa. And particularly when we looked at different socioeconomic variables, we found that there was some differences, again, by race and income, and what this can mean when it comes to not only the potential of the potential development of those health disparities, but what this can mean from the standpoint of even that larger picture. So thinking about that first, or initially from the standpoint of the health disparities, we want to reposition this a bit more to this area of health equity. And this is the vision that all people are having access, equal access to achieve optimal health. So while we think of vegetation and green spaces in the context of cities and what this can mean, being able to reposition the conversation of what this can indicate or really feed into some of those larger issues of affordable housing, neighborhood walkability, and even job creation and youth engagement are going to be really, really important. So with this particular document, or actually figure, we adapted a figure that was provided by Mary Northwich and others from Columbia University, but really reposition this in the context of urban green spaces to again connect the dots. Because when we don't do this, it's very easy to underestimate the contribution that vegetation may be having in an urban setting and what this means for the possibility of achieving health equity across different communities. And as I mentioned before, from the standpoint of even the social dynamics, being able to understand what do these places mean to different types of people? What does it provide? And during this pandemic, this has been a conversation that more people are asking, not only from an academic standpoint, but that in a larger sense. For example, the National Recreation and Park Association did a public engagement report in 2020, and they found that throughout the pandemic, different parks and green spaces were at times the only outlets that people had in order to get out and exercise at a distance, to really decompress, and even to reconnect with others in a more safer setting. But with that in mind, these social connections also connect to different dimensions of health that we cannot afford to underestimate. So again, we went back to the literature to see not only how can we reposition the conversation of social determinants of health with these benefits of green spaces, but what does this mean to public health? Because when we don't have the language, when we aren't really categorizing it from the standpoint, again, we can underestimate the contributions that are made in cities and beyond. So with that, we found some different outcomes that we wanted to highlight in this area of work. And this included place attachment. How do people develop a sense of place and a version of where they're from based on the opportunities that they have to visit these spaces and connect with others? Social support is really, really important when we think about the times that we've been in. I mean, some may often forget that actually loneliness and isolation was a major public health issue before the pandemic. But when we truncate that into the times that we're in, and then think about what that means now, having avenues of social support and belonging are even more critical. Next, it was even thinking that from the sense of empowerment. How do these spaces bring about places where people can gather and engage and have a sense of community and value? Community is very important, whether that's virtual, but also we realize in person is also important. So when that's cultivated in these spaces, or kids having places where they can play safely, engage in sports, this becomes very important to different dimensions of well-being. The scholars have been talking about throughout time how social contact, how being able to interact with others is really, really important to health. But far too long, we've underestimated what access to these green spaces can mean in that larger conversation of health promotion, particularly in cities. So with that, this is an area of work that has been laid out, or there have been hints of it rather through the years. But this article was actually one of the first to reposition it in the larger sense of what this means for social cohesion, but what this means for diverse populations and the larger conversation of health promotion in the United States as well as in the world. So again, we're connecting those areas to not only what they mean, but what this means for public health. So while that's a bit of my scholarship, and I'll dive into it a bit more, another area that I'm also energized about is really positioning this in the larger conversation of engaging with communities and what this means from the standpoint of education, but also getting people outdoors. Through the years, I've been contributed to a number of articles, and one of them was in a magazine where we talked about really reinvigorating the conversation of conservation and social equity. From the standpoint of the environmental field, conservation is about conserving the integrity of environmental systems and natural systems, which is important and has its place. But when we think about that moving forward with different aspects of people, giving those opportunities for kids of all ages to get out, but also to really be able to connect with others and learn is really, really important. So this particular picture, I want to give a shout out to colleagues at the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, but also Dr. Nataki Osborne-Jokes in her work when it comes to really their team getting people into these spaces. Because again, if the access isn't there and the knowledge isn't being shared, there's that gap. And when that happens, we also have to think about this from the standpoint of even how cities are changing in ways that development can get ahead of itself or it has to really balance the scales. But even in terms of how even aspects of gentrification and green gentrification, more specifically, when it comes to my area of work, how this again begins to impact health, but not only health in general, but also the health of different types of people throughout the United States and also throughout the world. So this is one of the articles that we published last year, really talking about this from the standpoint of what this means or what it can imply from the sense of what green gentrification can mean when it comes from a socio-psychological standpoint, but really connecting that to health. When the places that people call home are changing and what that means and how we have to get ahead of it so that we understand what this means from the standpoint of public health, but how people connect, how people belong, and to really move forward in a standpoint of repositioning it, not only in the standpoint of planting the tree, in the standpoint of its ecological value and the role that it plays in environmental systems. But how do we connect this to a larger social mission that's going to be critical to not only how we connect to one another, but how we connect to the environment and really seeing ourselves as a part of that larger system to which we're all connected to. And this involves different types of social engagement, but also ways that we consider this area of work for the larger conversation of how people are connecting, but really how we're also developing our cities in ways that we are not only doing this from the standpoint of being good stewards, but also thinking about this from the standpoint of we really think about the way that we regard environmental aspects of the environment, such as urban green spaces. But one of the other standpoints that I've made in a recent article in Nature Communications, when we think about the pressures that we're putting on cities and the diverse people that are impacted in the process, we have to be careful that we aren't expecting nature to save us from our lack of stewardship or the areas that we need to improve. When it comes to the stressors that we're introducing to cities as well as to our health, we have to reposition the conversation, not only from the standpoint of revisiting those inventories of how we monitor air pollution so that we can capture, even from the standpoint of ozone formation, where that is in the troposphere being the lowest level of the atmosphere and how we're contributing to it, but how we need to reposition the actions we need to take so that we can partner with nature and different amenities such as green infrastructure to really reposition how we're living, how we're thriving, and how we're going to be able to sustain ourselves as well as the environment throughout that. So again, while those are some of the academic contributions that I've made throughout the years, I'm definitely mobilized to getting my work out into different segments in the larger audience, as it was mentioned before. And here's a brief, just some screenshots of different work that I've contributed through the years. For example, providing expert features in Shondaland Media, where they were talking about the importance of really filling this gap and what this means across diverse audiences. And toward the bottom, there was a blog contribution that I made to building a Healthy Places Network, where we talked about really what this means again in the standpoint of cities, but really what this means in terms of social connectedness and how we cannot underestimate this variable in the larger conversation of health and what healthy cities are. And also to an article that I wrote earlier this year, actually, for the conversation, and it was cross-referenced in a number of outlets. But when we think about those resolutions that we need to make to the environment in 2020 and beyond, what that means for public health, what that means for how we connect with one another, but also what that means for how we need to reposition our thought when it comes to how we interact with the environment as well as one another moving forward. Definitely, as you continue to navigate this space, a few tools that I wanted to share, for example, are the EcoHealth browser, which is from the US Environmental Protection Agency. And this particular browser literally lets you click on different attributes in the space of green infrastructure and urban ecosystems. And as you click on those different circles that are noted on this resource, you'll be given a different tab of different studies that provide context as to what this means when it comes to a public health perspective. And also other resources can include a resource from a colleague of mine, Alessandro Rigolone, when he talks about what this can mean from a standpoint of gentrification and what that means for displacement in parks throughout the United States. So if that's an area that you're interested in, that's a resource that he's provided. And even from the standpoint of stewardship, different types of communities and how they connect. Some previous colleagues from the Forest Service have different maps that really begin to outline what this means in different cities, the ways that people are providing volunteer opportunities, and what that means to connect to stewardship, but also connecting to different social networks that are important. So while I recognize the audience that I'm speaking to being youth and your interest in this particular field, there are other resources that I wanted to make sure that I share with you to provide context to your journey. One of those is the Manners Organization, which stands for the Minorities in Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Related Sciences. I became partnered or at least exposed to Manners in my freshman year of college. And they have different chapters, whether it's the collegiate chapters, but they also have junior Manners for high school students, and their membership goes all the way up to the professional level. I would encourage you to look at different organizations that can be an avenue to not only expose you to different career opportunities, but where you can meet people who are in this particular area of work. A number of mentors that I have and still have through these years, I met through the Manners Organization. So I would encourage you to check out their website for those resources. Also want to give a shout out to the FAMU School of the Environment, but also for youth, particularly if you're in Florida, they have a summer camp. I actually used to be a summer camp instructor for the FAMU School of Environment summer camp. So that would be an avenue for you to learn again more about the field, get plugged in to the resources at the School of the Environment, but also that particular summer camp is expenses covered. So if you want to really learn more about the environmental field and what avenues are exposed, career avenues are exposed in this particular area of work. That's another one. And from the academic standpoint, there's the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. I've published a number of my articles there, but I also wanted to note it because it's open access, meaning you can go onto the internet and you can readily access their journal articles without needing a university affiliation to access those. Two other resources that I wanted to provide to you was two particular books. One of them is Strength Finder 2.0. As you are going through your career path and really thinking about where you want to make your mark or really contribute, this particular book was helpful to me because it helped me to realize what were some of my natural strengths. And even though I was in college, even though I was in graduate school and gone throughout different parts of my career thus far, when I tapped into some of my natural strengths, it actually helped me in those areas as well. So to give you an example, one of my strengths is being a connector, being able to really connect and synthesize different areas of thought and realizing how it connects to a much larger picture. And this is really important when it comes to moving a field and really advancing our area of work. But I encourage you to check out this book and even do the survey so that you can find out what are some of your natural strengths, so that whichever path that you choose, you can be in an area of work that really helps you to build on and exercise those strengths as you move throughout different aspects of your career. Another book, this is an oldie but goodie, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And it really just talks about some different shifts that you can make from the standpoint of your mindset when it comes to being proactive, really beginning with the end in mind, putting first thing first, where your priorities should be, where you should really invest your time and energy from a strategic standpoint, so that as you go throughout your career, you can know what it is you need to prioritize and how you need to adjust in order to get to your desired goals. Seeking first to understand and be understood. This is when we have to constantly recalibrate ourselves, because one of the aspects of science and even the field of different aspects of the field arena is really tapping into curiosity, whether that's really developing and operating from a standpoint of empathy so that you can experience and be able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, but also to have that curiosity to really fuel being a learner. I'm sitting here with a PhD, but I can tell you there are different things I'm learning about my field and the society around me all the time. So really having that thirst for knowledge and really tapping into those critical thinking skills are really going to help you as you continue to move forward. As you're already doing this Saturday morning, being here on this webinar, exposing yourself to different types of career paths, setting a vision and discipline. My faith, my connection to family and friends have definitely helped me on my journey. But really thinking about how you need to make those shifts throughout your career, but also out of your life is going to be really important for your next steps. Because while I'm here talking about science and scholarship, I want you to also really think about, what does success look like to you? You'd be surprised, people who may go through careers throughout life, but really thinking about, what does success mean to you? But not only what do you want your craft to be and where you want to put your area of work, but who do you want to be as a person? And really tapping into that, so that you are not only developing your mind, you're not only developing your heart, your hustle, but you also are using your area of thought as a place of service, because we definitely need you. There's definitely areas where we can continue to build on, and you are a part of the legacy that we have, not only as African Americans, but also just as scientists in this area of work. So you got work to do, and I want to thank you for this opportunity again, and I look forward to engaging with the questions that you've had throughout the session. Are there any questions? Any questions? Any questions?
Am I okay? Can you see me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Wow. That was an amazing presentation. I was just so enthralled towards the end. You know,
Thank you.
one question that I did want to pose to you is, being someone, as evident from your presentation, who has provided so much research to the field and to advance the field, what got you started and interested in STEM yourself?
Great question. Well, I will give a full disclosure. I've been a nerd for a long time. Definitely that kid, enjoying the outdoors, putting a lot of work into my science fair project. So that curiosity with science was always there. I would say one of the junctures when it came to the natural environment, more specifically, was when I was in grade school and I was learning about the Amazon rainforest. And it was, we were talking about what is the Amazon rainforest? And it was so beneficial. And I asked my parents, okay, if it's so important, why are we tearing it down? And why are these different things happening when it came to not only the destruction of the environment, but what it meant for us? And as a grade schooler, it was just learning about this natural wonder, but also our role in terms of how we were not being good stewards of it, and what that meant later on. So that was in some of the initial seeds that were planted. And I would say in high school, for sure, learning about environmental justice and even seeing different issues within my community, within, the expansion of landfills and speculations of what that may have meant for the public health of our area. I wanted to really begin to connect the two when it came to the environment and then health, and see what that could mean moving forward.
Wow. That is really cool to hear, because I think when you do hear about, science education, I was going to say STEM education, but really science education, and stories like yours that I'm sure other STEM professionals can also connect with, is those classes, those, museum visits that really made a difference and really opened up their minds to this STEM pathway and STEM career. So I love how you also ended with encouraging youth to look at what their natural skills are.
Yes.
So I think
natural strengths.
yes. I feel like if they're able to do that, then they could make some connections to what STEM fields, whether it's environmental science and public health, or engineering, for example, what their interests can lead, where their interests can lead them to. And so my next question is, as far as your your college experience, and you said that you also, if no one, excuse me, just in case no one didn't catch it, this is Dr. Viniece Jennings. She has her PhD PhD too, but what would be your advice for doing the work? I know at some point in the presentation you said that you had to look through a lot of other research and data for one of your scholarly journals. So what advice would you give to youth in doing the work, keeping up with the work, if they might feel stressed and pressured, things like that?
Right. Well, you mentioned a few things, so I want to make sure I categorize that I cover all of them. When it comes to where I decided to go to college, I'm a proud graduate of 2 historically Black colleges. At the same time, I had offers from a number of institutions. I had a number of institutions, and one of the plugs on my first slide was the 1890 National Scholars Program. Through the USDA. So being in that scholarship program, providing an avenue, just to give some context, with that scholarship, there are a list of majors and there are a list of historically Black colleges. If you're selected, you are chosen by an agency to further your education. So while I had a number of offers, I also looked at the one that was cost effective, because I knew, particularly for my interest in the sciences and where I thought I wanted to go, I was going to need more than a master's. And I'm a frugal person by nature. So I was not trying to have unnecessary debt. So I would say, in the standpoint of really developing interest, to truly cast a wide net, whether historically Black colleges, well, just everywhere when it comes to your career options and your educational options. I'm definitely grateful for the training that I have. So looking at the funds and even the support that's available to students with an interest in STEM, make sure you look at institutions that are going to provide that financial support, such as the ones that I did, so that can help position you even from the standpoint long term. When it comes to having that thirst for the knowledge and really keeping up with the literature, again, those are some seeds that were planted throughout the years. I remember as a graduate student at FAMU and even in college, a number of my professors would provide the journals in our common area so that we could keep up with the articles and really be able to have those discussions of, okay, what is this saying about the field now? What are some things that are missing? How can our work help to push it forward? So being around people who definitely helped us to stay up to the literature, but you have to have that thirst for it yourself as well. If it's anything that you want to develop when it comes to your craft, you have to be a student at it. And that has to be a lifelong process when it comes to the area of work. When it comes to managing stress, that's a journey. I'm not going to say every day of my journey has been stress-free, but I will say that when it comes to your area of thought, really have that balance for your life in the standpoint of working hard, being a person of excellence, an overachiever, if you will. That's something that is there, but having that balance in life is going to be important. But I really want to implore people to have that community, whether it's your colleagues, whether it's friends outside of work, friends within work, but really having that balance so that you continue to balance yourself throughout the process. Being able to connect with other people who have gone through similar experiences was also very critical, because very few people in my family have gone to college, but I was definitely the first to get a PhD. And there's a scene in the movie Hidden Figures where Janelle Monáe was talking about the pressures of being the first. Doing something is energizing, but it's also the pressures that come with that. So I reached out to a number of mentors who had gone before me, who have played such a key role in my success and still do. So learning from their stories, getting wisdom from them was also very, very beneficial. But also remembering that my identity isn't what I do. It's in who I am and what I feel that I'm called to do on a larger scale. I'm proud of the work that I've done. I've definitely had to hustle in terms of this area of work, but my identity isn't in my resume. So that's why when I mentioned, who do you want to be as a person? That's going to be really important. I mean, even last night I was editing a book chapter that I'm contributing to when it comes to green spaces and health, but also was looking at Medea's homecoming. So it's just that balance of, living your life, but also letting your work being a part of it in the sense of what it is you do, but also the person you want to become.
That was wonderful. Oh my goodness. You have just shared so much in addition to, hearing about the research, so much value that you can take away in crafting their own STEM pathway in STEM career. Or, if they just have a curiosity for STEM, then, well, we're here for the STEM career stuff. Okay, so it looks like to wrap us up, we are going to okay, we're just out there.
Okay, so I do have one question because when I think about your papers and I think about Dr. Osborne Jokes and how we saw this week, she was like riding on the Chattahoochee. Was she in the Chattahoochee?
I remember seeing her on a boat. I'm not sure what
she
was
boat in some water, right? Okay. It has to be important to Atlanta because our senator wouldn't be there, right? Yep. And so my question to you is, when we think about scientists and policy and how science in our research shape policy, can you talk a little bit about how important that was? Because I was starting to test us like, girl, you're on a boat with the senator. Like, are you helping him write a bill? Like, how is this? And so that connection, of how science can really help shape policy and, all the things you publish. Yeah.
Right. Well, that definitely, giving a shout out to her and the tremendous work that she has done throughout the years, as a leader in the community and as an academic in so many areas of service that she is in. There's that intersection because science is where we get new areas of knowledge, in terms of being able to reposition ourselves, not only as a society and health, but also when it comes to the way that we steward the environment. It's one thing to hear about something, is one thing to have a speculation, but it's another thing to really look at an area of thought from an academic standpoint and empirically analyze it, or to think about what has been established in this area previously so that we're not redoing the same thing in a way that we already know is ineffective. So when it comes to that intersection of science and policy, is really being an avenue to inform the way that we go about decision making, but also that we govern in a way that's going to be strategic, but really upholding the values that we say we have. So those types of visits become ways of exposure and really to think about it from a different standpoint. And that's really important to me because the lived experiences of different people is going to be a way that we can do that in a strategic way, but it's also going to be of service to all people.
Okay. And one more question when it comes to science communication, because I was like, she's writing books, she's written papers, all of these things. Why is it so important to communicate your science and your research findings?
Definitely a good question. Well, from the standpoint of communication, there are different avenues for that to take place. In the peer-reviewed audience is one avenue. You have some of the larger outlets that I've contributed to, whether that was Shondaland, NPR, and so many others. I don't want to hold this insight to just the academics. The way that what fuels me again is different aspects of service. So when we don't bring those stories to light or communicate it in a way that different people can have interactions with that knowledge, I think we're doing the field a disservice. Because when people have access to the knowledge or be exposed to it, that's when we can really begin to communicate the benefits in another way. We can bring those stories of different communities to light, but we're really beginning to get the information out of the silos, if you will. As I mentioned in some of the previous work, for far too long, the environmental folks were just talking to one another. The health folks were just talking to one another. And we weren't having a very collective conversation. And when we were doing that, it wasn't helping those fields, but it also wasn't helping the public. So now conversations around green spaces and health are a lot more mainstream. And there's a lot of insight. But now that flow is happening not only between fields, but you have folks who are really spearheading that in their communities. There are people who are talking about it, whether it's from podcasts and different avenues. So it energizes me because the insight and the fruits of science, I don't want to just keep to scientists. And when I think about the people that I serve, but also even the what mobilizes me as a scholar. It has to get out in order for it to happen. During my times, even in DC, when we would look up different insight, if someone in a senator's office or someone who is in a policy forum can't access the academic article, how are they going to get to know what it means? And we have to be honest, everyone's not sitting around, reading the peer-reviewed articles. So if I were to just leave it there, the knowledge won't get to the masses where it belongs.
Okay, and one final question, because you're a double HBCU alumna, which a couple of questions. Well, how is that experience, right? Because a lot of people are like, oh yeah, get your undergraduate degree, from a HBCU. But then they're like, don't go to HBCU for a grad school, right? As an HBCU alum, I'm like, get all your degrees that you can. And I feel like HBCU graduate programs are slept on, right? And the value of them. And so can you talk a little bit about the value of you being a double HBCU alumna, and why was the HBCU for graduate school a good choice for you, and how do suggestions for people who are considering going to HBCU grad school but may be discouraged to not do that and go that path?
Right. Interesting question, because I reflect on, even when I was in high school, I got a number of those. We had a number of those conversations, or those came up. I was salutatorian of my high school class. I had offers from a number of institutions. One of in some, there was full paid rides to different schools, or the highest scholarship I could get to those institutions. So I would say, from the longevity, I chose the path also that would not only enrich my social experience, but also that would provide that financial support. I don't have any student loans, bachelor's through PhD. And with the USDA 1890 scholars, it was not only scholarship, it wasn't only the funding, but it was also, being paired with an organization for employment opportunities. So, the full stress of having a job at graduation, thankfully, wasn't something that I had to go through. So when it came to graduate school, again, I applied to different institutions. And one of the things that I think, regardless of where you decide to pursue your education, is to know who you are. To know who you are at your core, the type of experiences that you want to cultivate, not only for your career, but for your life, but also being aligned with the people that you want your area of work to be rooted in. So when I learned about the FAMU School of the Environment, and there were different people that I met who I didn't even realize had ties to the institution. The FAMU School of the Environment is one of the top producers of African Americans in PhDs with environmental science. So while someone else may say, oh, there's this other option, when it came to not only the funding, and it's interesting because when I applied to grad school, I remember particularly that I applied to master's programs. And because a part of me was still thinking of, do I want to get a master's in public health? Do I want to get the master's? But again, I'm thinking of, where can I also get financial support? So FAMU School of Environment saw my package and they say, we think you would be a really strong candidate for a PhD. And we have funding to go all the way throughout. So they saw what I could provide to the field, but they were also providing financial backing. And while I've gone to different universities and spoken, or I've been at different colleges or conferences, and I meet students of color who are energized about the work, but they may not have that diversity within their faculty. They may be the only student who is a person of color, and they may not have any faculty from that background. I have a number of faculty members at FAMU who are African American. So seeing a person of color with a PhD was something I was very exposed to. And that energized me to say that I can get this as well. And I also have to give a shout out to my advisor in grad school, Dr. Richard Gregg, because, his area of work is in environmental toxicology and health disparities. So while I came in as a student, with the natural environment and thinking about green spaces, his tutelage really helped to formulate different aspects of thinking about this and solidifying the areas that we were doing with health disparities. So at that time, people were asking, why are they asking this question? Is this important? Now everyone's doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when it comes to not only the social experience, being able to see different types of professors that show you that it can be done, but also in the environment that you are going to be in when it comes to your academic experience. Grad school can have its own stressors. So you want to make sure when it comes to other dynamics that can occur in any institution. I just didn't have to fight for that as much when it came to my experience at FAMU. And I'm a rattler. I mean, come on.
Mm-hmm. Well, any parting words of wisdom to youth before we close that you want to share with any advice to get into their field?
Well, one, I just want to, tell to keep them encouraged with this area of work. Like I said, they could be doing anything else on a Saturday, but they decided to be here, continuing to plug into different networks. I mentioned the Manners Organization, FAMU School of Environment, plug into those different communities, because whether, you know what you want to do right now, finding those different organizations and communities to really help you stay energized are going to be so important. You don't have to feel like you have to know all the answers. Michelle Obama often says the question of what are you going to be when you grow up? We're still learning. We're still evolving. Who you are now, who you're going to be 10 years from now, and 20 years from now may change. But really solidifying your environments. The word says bad company corrupts good manners. Think about who you're around, who you need to be around in order to get to your goals, and be willing to put the work in. Be willing to put the work in. You want to learn more about science? Pick up a book. Reduce the distractions to really learn about the richness of the fields. Because, when I think about, as we're concluding Black History Month, but just in general, African Americans and so many scholars have contributed to science in really amazing ways. Continue to learn about them. And just remember that even at your phase of life, you are somebody's history already, and we're ready to pass the baton to you so that we can keep running this race for science, for our cities, and all that the field has to offer.
Okay, now.
Those are great closing words. So those who either tune in live or catching on YouTube later, we have a survey in the chat. So please take a few moments to complete this survey. And Dr. Jennings, I want to thank you so much for making time to be our speaker and let us know the connection of health and this. I didn't even think about the connection. Like, I knew your work, but I was like, oh yeah, environmental science really does impact our health, right?
Yes. It does.
So many areas. And so, do you have anything, updates to share, Carlin, before we go on about anything?
The only update to share is, next week is going to be the start of March. We always do Instagram takeovers and lives. And so to celebrate Women's History Month, we will be having an Instagram takeover next Thursday with a cybersecurity professional at Equifax. So I definitely encourage you to jot that down, that we'll be having that takeover on Thursday, and join us at 5:30 for the Instagram Live on our page.
Okay. Well, again, thank you, Dr. Jennings, and thank everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.